The Canadian Prime Minister just told the U.S. President to burn in hell in front of the camera on national television. Then he took a step that no Canadian leader had taken before. He launched a methodical economic attack on the United States while the comments were still having an impact. Oil pipeline traffic decreased by 30% in the United States. Critical mineral exports are forbidden. Border crossings reduced to a crawl. The Canadian ambassador was recalling from Washington. Carney had already boarded a plane to London, and NORAD cooperation had been formally evaluated before Trump had finished reading the news. Trump's response was more than just getting more intense. It escalated beyond what his own party had expected. When he signed emergency executive orders within a day that placed 100% tariffs on all Canadian imports and froze Canadian government financial assets held in American institutions, Republican senators went public, suggested relocating U.S. military hardware to the boundary in the north. When Warren Buffett's warning broke through the din, Wall Street froze. He said the next 48 hours would determine if this damage is irreversible or reversible. When you hear what the Oracle of Omaha said about the specific economic consequences already occurring and why he believes the United States is within days of crossing a line it cannot uncross, you will understand why, tonight, for the first time in this trade war, people in Washington are using the word catastrophe without exaggeration. What happens next will determine the destiny of the most important alliance in the Western world. Therefore, get involved right away, because this is occurring more quickly. This was not a press conference. Carney declined to respond to questions. He delivered a nationally televised statement, which is how Canadian prime ministers handle real national emergencies, like pandemics, wars, or constitutional crises. This structure has never before been employed by a Canadian prime minister for a bilateral issue with the United States. Carney spoke for 8 minutes. The first 6 were well-controlled, measured, and factual. A thorough description of every provocation, insult, failed diplomatic effort, tariff, and public humiliation that Canada has experienced over the course of months of growing antagonism from the Trump administration. He read the chronology with the same attention to detail, accuracy, and date that a prosecutor would while reading an indictment. Every insult is listed, along with the day it was delivered and the platform it was posted on. Every effort through private channels, every diplomatic suggestion, every senior official dispatched to Washington, every concession and compromise made, every rejection recorded, and every escalation recorded. In front of Canadian-American International, a head of state was arguing the morality and legality of what he was going to do. 6 minutes of evidence, 6 minutes of restraint, 6 minutes of a guy laying such a solid foundation that his subsequent remarks would be unquestionable. In the final 2 minutes, the tone shifted. The teleprompter's rhythm disappeared. Carney gazed directly into the camera. His tone shifted from that of a statesman to that of a man who had been fed up for months, not with his notes or the press, but with the lens. He said, "This administration has insulted our sovereignty, attacked our economy, threatened our industries, and demanded our submission. We responded with patience, we responded with diplomacy, we responded with good faith, and we were met with contempt. So let me say this clearly, so there is no ambiguity, so there is no room for misinterpretation or diplomatic softening. Canada will not submit. Canada will not surrender its sovereignty. Canada will not be absorbed, annexed, bullied, or humiliated into compliance. And if the President of the United States believes otherwise, he can go to hell." The room froze. Canadian journalists gasped. International correspondents scrambled to file. The clip went viral within 90 seconds, the fastest-spreading political moment in Canadian history. Social media servers strained under the traffic. Newsrooms broke into programming. The phrase was confirmed, replayed, confirmed again. A sitting head of government had just told the President of the United States to go to hell on live television, in a formally scheduled national address with the full weight of the office behind every syllable. And then, before the shock had even settled, before the clip had finished its first viral cycle, Carney continued. And what he said next was worse for the United States than the insult. 6 actions announced in sequence, each one landing like a separate detonation. First, an immediate 30% reduction in crude oil pipeline flows to the United States, effective within 72 hours under the authority of a national energy security reallocation. Second, a full export ban on critical minerals to the United States: nickel, cobalt, lithium, graphite, rare earths, aluminum, effective immediately, with no exemptions. Third, the implementation of enhanced customs protocols at all land border crossings, a bureaucratic phrase that meant commercial freight was about to slow to a crawl. Fourth, the recall of Canada's ambassador from Washington for indefinite consultations, one diplomatic step below severing relations entirely. Fifth, a formal review of Canada's participation in NORAD, the Joint Aerospace Defense Command that has protected North American airspace for 65 years, with Carney stating that Canada would assess whether its defense arrangements reflected the current state of the bilateral relationship. Sixth, an immediate diplomatic offensive, Carney departing within hours for London, Brussels, and Tokyo to meet with Allied leaders and build an international coalition. 6 actions. The go to hell was the headline. The strike package was the substance, and together they constituted the most aggressive action any Allied nation has taken against the United States since the Suez Crisis in 1956. Polling within 24 hours showed 78% of Canadians approved of both the statement and the actions. The world had just watched Canada do something nobody thought possible: go on the offensive against the United States, not defensively, not reactively, and everyone was watching to see what Trump would do. They didn't have to wait long. The Truth Social barrage began within minutes of Carney's address ending. 6 posts in 40 minutes, all caps, escalating fury with each one. Canada will pay a price they never imagined. The most devastating sanctions in history are coming. Carney is a weak, pathetic leader who just destroyed his own country. We will shut them down completely and totally. The posts arrived faster and faster. Spelling errors multiplied. Syntax deteriorated. Aides were reportedly unable to get the phone away from him. One senior staff member told a journalist he wasn't reading anything. He wasn't listening to anyone. He was just posting. The posts told a story on their own, not of strategy, not of calculation, of a man in a spiral. Each post angrier than the last, each one less coherent, each one pushing the confrontation further into territory where de-escalation becomes harder with every sentence. Markets, already jittery from Carney's strike package, began their nosedive in after-hours trading. As the posts multiplied, futures dropped with each new post, as if traders were watching a man dismantle the North American economy 280 characters at a time. Within 6 hours, the fury moved from social media to executive action. Trump convened an emergency economic security meeting in the Situation Room. Reports from inside described him as pacing, red-faced, and interrupting every advisor who attempted to counsel restraint. The Secretary of the Treasury reportedly tried to explain the economic consequences of a 100% tariff on Canadian imports. Trump cut him off mid-sentence. The trade representative attempted to present alternative options: targeted tariffs, diplomatic channels, a cooling-off period. Trump reportedly slammed the table and said, "I don't want options, I want them to pay." Emergency executive orders were signed in rapid succession, each one more extreme than the last. A 100% tariff on all Canadian imports, effective immediately, no exceptions, no phase-in period, no carve-outs for any sector, no consideration for American companies that depend on Canadian inputs. The nuclear option on trade deployed not as a calculated strategy, but as an expression of rage. A directive to the Treasury Department to freeze Canadian government financial assets held in American institutions, sovereign wealth fund accounts, government operating funds, diplomatic accounts, an action normally reserved for hostile states like Iran and North Korea, now directed at America's closest ally. an order to ICE to implement enhanced scrutiny of all Canadian nationals at every American port of entry, effectively turning every Canadian crossing the border into a prolonged security screening event, punishing millions of innocent people for the words of their Prime Minister. And a formal demand that American companies cease all non-essential operations in Canada within 90 days, a demand so sweeping that compliance would require dismantling 4 decades of economic integration. Each order inflicting enormous economic damage, not just on Canada, but on the American businesses, workers, and consumers who depend on $2.5 billion in daily cross-border commerce for their livelihoods. The 100% tariff alone was projected to cost American consumers $180 billion annually, and higher prices on everything from automobiles to energy to food to construction materials. Advisors were leaking to the press in real time, anonymous calls to reporters from inside the White House describing what one official called the most chaotic 6 hours since January 6th. Another advisor, speaking on condition of anonymity, said simply, "Nobody is steering this. Nobody has control over the plan. No plan exists. There is only rage." And then, within 24 hours, Trump's fury crossed the line that his own party could not follow. In a late-night call with Republican congressional leadership, Trump reportedly demanded authorization to economically crush Canada until they apologized, and suggested, reportedly more than once, that American military assets should be repositioned along the northern border as a precautionary measure. The military suggestion leaked immediately. Congressional staff, horrified, were calling reporters within the hour. By morning, Republican senators who had stood by Trump through impeachments, through indictments, through every scandal and controversy of 2 presidential terms, senators who had never publicly broken with the president on any issue of substance, were breaking. The chairman of the Armed Services Committee went on camera. Repositioning military forces toward Canada is not a serious proposal. It is an alarming suggestion from a president who appears to be making decisions based on personal fury rather than national interest. I will not support it, I will not authorize it, and I will oppose it with everything at my disposal. A senior Republican senator who had endorsed Trump in 3 consecutive election cycles said, "I have supported this president through difficult moments. It's not a difficult moment. This is a dangerous one, and I will not stay silent while the leader of our party suggests military posturing toward a Democratic ally." The chairman of the Joint Chiefs reportedly told the Secretary of Defense that repositioning military assets toward the Canadian border would be the most destabilizing action in North American security since the War of 1812. Trump's fury had intensified through 3 stages in 24 hours, from rage post to retaliatory executive orders to a suggestion so extreme that it broke the loyalty of allies who had never broken before. The man whose political superpower was keeping his party in line had finally crossed the line his party wouldn't cross. And that's when Warren Buffett spoke. Buffett broke his silence, not with a written statement, but with a live television appearance, the first time in the entire trade war he had chosen to appear on camera rather than issue a statement through Berkshire Hathaway. That choice alone was the signal. Written statements are routine. Shareholder letters are scheduled. Live television appearances for a man who measures every public word are emergencies. What's happening right now between the United States and Canada is not a trade war, Buffett said. Trade wars have winners. This is a demolition, and the building being demolished is the economic architecture that both countries need to function. He leaned forward. The next 48 hours will determine whether this
damage is recoverable or permanent. I want to be precise about what I mean by that. The oil pipeline reduction takes effect in 72 hours. The mineral ban is already active. The border slowdowns will hit the auto industry within 48 hours. If these actions on the Canadian side are not reversed and the executive orders on the American side are not rescinded within that window, the economic restructuring on both sides becomes self-reinforcing. Supply chains will begin permanently rerouting. Contracts will be broken and new ones signed with other partners. Investments will be redirected to other countries, and once that happens, you cannot reverse it with a phone call or an executive order. The economic geography of North America will be physically, structurally, permanently different. Recoverable or permanent, that was the binary, and the 48-hour clock was now ticking. Buffett's tone shifted when he addressed the cause. "I've watched every crisis in American economic history since 1945, he said. Recessions, crashes, pandemics, wars. In every single case, the damage was caused by external forces or systemic failures, things that happened to us. This is the first time in my 94 years that I've watched the American economy be deliberately damaged by its own president in response to a personal insult. The damage isn't collateral, it's the point. The economic destruction isn't an unfortunate side effect of a policy dispute, it is the policy. And that is more frightening than any recession or market crash I've lived through. Because recessions end when conditions change. This ends only when one man's ego is satisfied, and from what I can observe, it never is. Berkshire Hathaway was activating contingency protocols across every Canadian exposed operation. BNSF railroad freight operations were disrupted as border crossings slowed to a fraction of normal throughput. Berkshire's energy subsidiaries were scrambling to secure alternative arrangements as pipeline flows began declining. Insurance subsidiaries were running catastrophic loss models on the projected cost of a full North American supply chain disruption. "Berkshire will survive this," Buffett said. "Berkshire survives everything. We survived the Depression. We survived 2008. We survived a pandemic. But the small businesses on both sides of this border, the workers, the families, they don't have the reserves to survive a 2-week trade war, let alone a permanent restructuring. And they are the ones paying for this, not the politicians, not the advisors, the people who drive the trucks and work the factories and stock the shelves." An anonymous board member told a financial journalist later that evening, "Warren's demeanor was unlike anything I've seen in 12 years on this board. Not angry, not sad, scared. On this board, I've encountered circumstances that would break most people. He has never displayed any symptoms of fear." The 48-hour damage report was catastrophic even before the clock had finished its first revolution. The Dow dropped 1,400 points in a single day, its largest decline in over a year. The S&P 500 fell 5.2%, resulting in losses across all industries. The breakdown is most noticeable in the energy and industrial sectors. Oil prices increased by $15 per barrel in a single session as the 30% pipeline closure approached execution. Even if the Canadian dollar dropped 4%, U.S. economic indicators were really plummeting more severely in absolute dollar terms, since the U.S. economy is larger and more susceptible to the disruption overall. Yield curves were inverting as investors fled to safe assets, causing chaos in the bond market. This suggested that rather than accounting for economic fundamentals, the market was pricing in the possibility of a recession caused by political wrath. Wall Street has simulations of trade wars. It features models of political crises. It has models for supply chain interruptions, currency volatility, and energy shocks. It does not provide a model for two partners simultaneously undermining each other's economies while their leaders disparage one another on live television. The models didn't work properly. The experts had to make do while the money fled. The physical economy followed the markets in a matter of hours. Production lines at Michigan car plants began to shut down. For just-in-time supply
chains that move parts across borders 6 or 8 times during assembly, 8-hour border delays are excessive. A single missing component, a wiring harness from Ontario, a stamped steel bracket from Quebec, an electronic module from a Brampton plant, halts an entire assembly line, and dozens of components were unexpectedly stuck in idle trucks on the Ambassador Bridge. 2 of General Motors' manufacturing facilities ceased operations. An emergency supply chain warning was sent to Ford's dealer network. When Stellantis ceased shifts, the American workers who traveled from Detroit every morning to work at the company's Windsor assembly plant were sent home. victims of a fight between executives who had never been to their place of employment. As the 30% pipeline reduction approached its 72-hour activation, Midwestern refineries voiced concerns about the availability of crude oil. These refineries need Canadian heavy oil to create the petrol, diesel, and jet fuel that power the American Midwest, and there isn't an alternative supply at the scale needed in any time frame shorter than years. The uncertainty immobilized ordering and logistics, causing the building material supply chain to fail. Nobody wanted to place a $1 million timber order when nobody could forecast the tariff rate or the state of the border within 24 hours, much less 24 weeks. Grocery chains notified supplier notifications for meat, dairy, and crossberries, areas where the supply chain crosses the border every day, and interruptions show up on store shelves in days as opposed to months. Energy suppliers in the Midwest and New England began desperately looking for alternate power sources prior to the potential loss of Canadian hydroelectric transmission, which supplies up to 20% of regional electricity. It had been a personal battle. There were physical consequences. Factory workers were sent home. Store shelves are becoming thinner. Prices are rising at every petrol station in the country. Trump's doom was imminent. Everyone else experienced financial hardship. The predicament started to be tangibly represented by the border itself. Canada's new customs processes turned major crossings into parking heaps that stretched for kilometers. The Ambassador Bridge, which links Detroit and Windsor and is the busiest commercial crossing in North America, carrying 25% of all truck traffic between the United States and Canada, was backed up 15 miles, with wait times exceeding 10 hours. An 8-mile bottleneck at Buffalo's Peace Bridge was caused by perishable goods spoiling in refrigerated cars with insufficient petrol. Seattle and Vancouver are connected by the Pacific Highway. Cars that passed in less than 20 minutes now had to wait 6 hours. The $2.5 billion USD in daily cross-border trades drops to a tiny fraction of their usual amount. The border was not closed, it was suffocated, and the more hours it was constricted, the more damage it caused. A series of missed deadlines, damaged goods, idle manpower, and broken promises result from every shipment that is delayed. Beyond the financial damage and its consequences, the Pentagon was rocked by the NORAD report. Both Canada's review statement and Trump's repositioning plan, which had been overturned within hours, caused considerable discomfort for the military command. Because an American president had stated it out loud, every defense planner in Washington had to modify their estimates. NATO allies were worried for reasons that extended far beyond Canada. If the United States was willing to propose military posturing toward its closest friend over a diplomatic affront, what did that mean for the credibility of American security promises to anyone? The war that started as an insult, escalated through economics, and stretched into defense now threatened the core tenet of every American alliance on Earth, that the United States can be trusted to not betray its own allies. Washington itself was immobilized in a way not seen since the constitutional crises of the preceding decade. Congress was unable to act. Republicans were split between Trump supporters who defended the executive orders as necessary demonstrations of power and those horrified by the
military suggestion, who were urging public moderation and discussing whether the 25th Amendment negotiations they had previously ignored were now worthwhile. The Democratic leadership was struggling to decide how to react, divided between denouncing Trump's actions and refraining from seeming to back a foreign regime against an American president. Cabinet ministers were reportedly providing journalists with off-the-record assessments that amounted to a single depressing message: "We are helpless to stop the president from making our situation worse every hour." The Secretary of State was despondent, according to aides. The Joint Chiefs and the Secretary of Defense reportedly communicated often about backup preparations in case the president formalized the recommendation for military repositioning. Career State Department officials who had served across administrations and dealt with crises in the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and the Korean Peninsula described the recalled ambassador situation as the most embarrassing diplomatic incident involving an allied nation in living memory. More senior officials were threatening to quit if the military repositioning was ever formalized as an order, and at least 2 had already engaged legal counsel. Washington was not in command. Washington was watching. There was conflict within the executive branch. Internal disputes immobilized the legislative branch, making coordination on any response impossible. Furthermore, a crisis driven only by national pride and presidential rage had little to do with the judicial department. While Trump issued executive orders and posted on Truth Social, Carney was on a plane. Trump's 72-hour diplomatic blitz was a calculated reflection of his emotional decline. When Trump was upset, he was composed. When he was responding, he was thoughtful. And when he was destroying, he was productive. European journalists began using the stark contrast as a framing device. One leader is forging alliances in world capitals at 2 in the morning, while the other is posting in all caps. Following a meeting with the UK Prime Minister in London, the two nations released a joint statement in which they pledged to boost economic cooperation between the UK and Canada, including quickening talks on a bilateral trade agreement that would fortify Commonwealth economic ties, and expressed serious concern about the US trade policies. An urgent meeting with the President of the EU Commission accelerated the implementation of the Canada-EU Comprehensive Economic and Trade Deal in Brussels. Sections that had been sitting in bureaucratic review for months were expedited, and the agreement's scope was broadened to include additional sections dealing to digital trade and essential minerals. During a meeting with the Japanese Prime Minister in Tokyo, the most strategically disastrous of the three agreements was achieved. It served as a basis for looking into strategic mineral supply alliances that would give Japan long-term, assured access to the very essential minerals that Canada had recently banned from being supplied to the U.S. Nickel, cobalt, lithium, and rare earth elements are desperately needed by Japan's electronics and automobile sectors. Offered on fair terms to a nation that would see Canada as a valued partner rather than a vassal state. In less than 72 hours, Carney spoke with 3 of the world's most powerful individuals and secured first agreements that would begin physically rerouting Canadian trade away from the United States and toward nations who were prepared to welcome it. When Trump's rage was posted, Carney organized a coalition. While Trump froze assets, Carney made contracts. While Trump threatened military posturing, Carney was welcomed in alliance capitals with the kind of love befitting world-respected leaders. The United States' adversaries were not required to take any action. China's foreign ministry released a carefully written statement expressing optimism for a peaceful resolution, in addition to formally offering Canada larger trade and investment agreements worth an estimated $40 billion over 5 years. The diplomatic equivalent of handing someone a business card at a funeral, but worth more than the GDP of most
countries. Without a reaction from Moscow, Russia barely concealed its joy at seeing the North American alliance structure collapse. Russian government media frequently aired the Carney video, portraying it as evidence that America's own allies were turning against it. The United States was ruining its own alliance system, damaging its own economy, and alienating its closest ally without any hostile response from Beijing or Moscow. The only thing America's adversaries needed to do was watch, and they did so with the particular joy of those who had spent decades working toward what Trump was now voluntarily accomplishing for them. Some of the damage was already irreversible, regardless of what happened afterward. Go to hell is now part of the permanent diplomatic record between the United States and Canada. Cited in all future North American relationship textbooks, stored in all foreign ministries worldwide, and searchable in all diplomatic databases. NATO threat assessments, Canadian defense planning documents, and the institutional memory of all allied armed forces now permanently memorialize Trump's demand for military relocation. The ambassador will recall the asset and freeze the 100% tariff even if they are all reversed tomorrow morning. The fact that they take place permanently changes the connection. A connection that has been broken and then repaired is not the same as one that has never been tested. The first is predicated on trust, which is the unspoken conviction that the other person will behave politely and consistently. The second is wary because it knows that the opposing side has shown that it is capable of animosity. Because caution is a constant cost on everything two nations do together. Every negotiation is a little more challenging, every agreement is a little more cautious, every assumption is a little less generous, and every handshake is a little less solid. Canadian energy companies had already called emergency meetings to accelerate the building of Pacific export facilities. Mining companies were arranging long-term supply agreements with customers in Europe, Japan, and Korea that would permanently exclude the United States. In order to circumvent the American border entirely, Canadian manufacturers were thinking about rearranging their supply lines. These discussions weren't theoretical. These entailed making travel arrangements, writing contracts, and shaking hands in boardrooms in Halifax, Toronto, and Vancouver. Once these new arrangements are in place, the oil is committed to Asian buyers under 20-year contracts, the minerals are contracted to European manufacturers, and the freight rail is redirected through Canadian ports. These agreements do not reverse just because the political environment cools. Infrastructure doesn't care about apologies. Contracts are unaffected by press conferences. Once it has changed, the economic geography stays that way. The people who paid the highest price were also those who had the least control over it. Workers on both sides of the border watched the news in living rooms after being sent home, wondering if they would still be employed in a month. Small businesses in border corridors, transportation companies, restaurants, suppliers, and customs brokers are all seeing a real-time decline in their profits. At the worst possible moment, American farmers are experiencing input disruptions due to mineral and potassium limitations. Families in Canada who have businesses, jobs, or relatives overseas find themselves in an unintentional crossfire. Cross-border communities that have long been unified economically, Detroit and Windsor, Buffalo and Fort Erie, Seattle and Vancouver, have all been torn apart by political decisions made by guys who have never been to any of these places. Leaders made the decision to go to hell. The economic damage occurred across nations, but the human cost occurred between neighbors. They live 20 minutes apart, work across the border, have children on the same hockey teams, and share the Great Lakes water and air. They did not start this conflict. Either way, they are footing the bill. So here we are. After ordering the U.S. president to go to hell on national television, the Canadian Prime Minister quickly launched a coordinated economic strike. The ambassador was recalled, border crossings were barred, oil was cut by 30%, essential minerals were prohibited, and NORAD was formally examined. Trump's anger increased in 3 phases during the course of the day. Rage his own party broke for the first time as a result of his retaliatory executive actions, which included 100% tariffs, asset freezes, and a request for military relocation. Markets fell 1,400 points on the Dow. Oil prices skyrocketed to $15 per barrel. Automobile plants in Michigan close. There was a 15-mile congestion at border checks due to truck traffic and spoiled perishable goods. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs called the military plan the most unstable since the War of 1812. In order to establish a worldwide alliance, Carney took flights to Tokyo, London, and Brussels. While Trump tweeted on social media at 2 in the morning, Warren Buffett warned that the next 48 hours will determine if this harm is reversible or irreversible in his first live television appearance of the entire trade war. And one of his board members said something that had never been heard before. He has never displayed any symptoms of fear. Buffett's 48-hour clock is almost up. The pipeline cuts take effect within 72 hours. Already, the border slowdowns are becoming worse every hour. The contracts being drafted in Vancouver, Tokyo, and Brussels will redirect Canadian trade from the United States for many years after they are signed. This isn't a negotiation anymore. Every hour of delay increases the long-term damage caused by the escalating confrontation between these two countries, and the only person who can end the American side of it is the one whose rage started it, and whose rage shows no signs of abating. Observe the upcoming 48 hours.
Check to see if the pipeline volumes are still declining. Watch to see whether the border reopens or stays closed. Watch to see if the contracts are signed in Tokyo. Check to see if any Republican senator has the courage to inform the president that his anger is destroying the most important partnership in the country. Because somewhere between anger and retaliation, the most important relationship in the Western world is dying right now. Canada fired at Trump and warned him to go to hell. The intensity of Trump's furious response is growing hourly. In addition, the alliance that kept North America safe, prosperous, and stable for 75 years is falling apart. Not because of economics, not because of policy, and not because of any actual conflict of national interest. Because one man is unable to control his anger, and the other man has finally ceased being polite.